Did you know that according to Harvard Business School, there are 30,000 different new products introduced every year, and 95% of them fail? Hi, this is Sarah from UserGuiding, and today we're talking about product failure. Let's get to it. So a product failure is when a product fails to garner enough demand after its launch and thus fails to recover its expenses. Common symptoms of this is basically a decrease in sales, an inability to recover expenses, more expenses than expected in the long term, and of course, an inability to stick in the market. And what is not a product failure? It is not always a hopeless case when you're launching a product and you're not seeing the numbers you want to see. For example, if at the first launch your product is not gaining that success, there might be a problem with your motto, with the audience you're working with the basic marketing techniques you're using, or maybe there might be some changes needed in the product. You might just recover from it. Let me give you a good example of what is not a product failure. I will be talking about a cool game called No Man's Sky by the independent game studio Hello Games. When the game was first being marketed, it had a lot to promise. The main theme was exploration. The users would be able to explore mountains, seas, even planets with their very own ecosystems. They could play multiplayer. Everyone was looking forward to it until its launch, where everyone found out that it wasn't necessarily what it was promised to be. It was pretty monotonous with the same color palettes and no multiplayer option. Everyone kind of hated the game at first, and the reviews were pretty bad until Hello Games decided that they didn't want to give it up, and they just kept updating the game until the promised features were added and users, the gamers playing the game, were satisfied. So now it is still a game, a very cool game you can access on Steam. You can see that just as sales and marketplace and market size and expenses are important in deciding whether a product is a failure or not, the reviews and the feedback from your users can also be very influential in deciding whether you're failing or not. And that is how you define product failure. How you know what a product failure is, and how you can notice if you're failing or not. But we don't know why products fail. One of the reasons why is most of the time product originality and a lack of it. If your product fails to bring something new to the table, it is doomed to fall behind other existing products that already serve the purpose. Another reason products fail is definitely inefficient timing. If you cannot schedule the launch of your product properly, it just might be that your product is definitely going to fail. Another reason why products fail that is probably in the same vein as this is poor planning of the marketing strategy and marketing plan. If you cannot start planning your product's launch from an early time period and extend it in a way that up until the launch you keep the audience entertained and interested, you just might fail. In fact, you are going to fail. Not knowing your customers, your audience, your market well can also result in guaranteed product failure. If you cannot do your market research right, you're just off the game, because market research means that you get to know your audience, the people who are actually going to be using the product, and it also helps you set a appropriate pricing for the product. This is another factor. If your pricing is off, most users, most customers aren't going to be interested in even giving it a chance. A weak launch can also be detrimental. If you launch and the first users that are trying out your product don't approve it, and you fail to move on that, you fail to act upon that negative response, you might as well fail. Product flaws are also important here. If your product is flawed, you know it, your first users know it, and you don't try to fix that, it equals failure. But let's not fret, let's not worry about that right now. Let's talk about something else. Let's look at our top examples. It's kind of funny to me how we tend to forget most of product failures, but then again, if people forget about your product's failure, that means people forget about your product. So not really good news. So let's talk about our number one failure, Samsung Note 7. You might remember the time when we were worried about phones catching fire, and this phone was the starting point of it all. Samsung Note 7s were the heat, literally, because they would catch on fire. Later on, it was found out that there was a problem with the battery software. So one even caught fire on a flight, so it was at one point illegal to get on a flight with one of these phones. Later, Samsung decided to say that they were wrong, that they failed, and the product was abandoned altogether. Remember when we were all going to die in 2012 and the world was gonna end? Well, according to Apple Maps, it kind of happened. Well, what happened was after the launch of iOS 6, Apple users started to use this new app in the system, Apple Maps. I was one of them. And what happened was it wasn't working properly. People would get lost in the city. The landmarks were gone, and when you try to see where you were at, the app would show users the pictures of demolished bridges and buildings. Obviously, the tool was kind of rushed and poorly planned, so it was kind of buggy and it failed, but hey, we still have the app. I don't use it, you probably don't use it. It's still there, but it failed. You just might know this one. Cyberpunk 2077 was one of the most anticipated games in 2020, and it kind of failed. Well, what happened was that the game was extremely buggy, laggy, and it just had a lot of shortcomings, and the gamers weren't satisfied. What was then found out was that the developers even weren't happy about the game, and it was rumored that some underexperienced developers were hired just to speed up the release a little. It's kind of like No Man's Sky. I mean, the game is kind of a good game now, and it did not really relapse. It has gotten better, but it still failed because of all the rushed workloads and under-experienced developer hirements and all, so I call it a fail. Next example is HP's Touchpad, which was supposed to be a product that could rival Apple's iPad, but what happened was it could only last 7 weeks on the market. The story is that it kind of was rushed into the market after, like, months after iPad 2's launch, and what happened was the performance or the speed or anything else, the design was not up to rivaling iPad 2. The users were already used to the operating system of iPad. WebOS was a huge flop. No one liked how it looked, so it just failed. This next one is a funny one. You might have heard of Cheetos Lip Balm at one point, but it has always been very funny to me because Cheetos dust is something that we get all over the place. It's always on our fingertips and on our mouth, on our face even. So I am asking Cheetos this right now. Why would they think it was a good idea to think that people would want it applied on their lips? There has been better decisions made in Las Vegas Chappelle's. There was a huge lack of demand for the product, and it is still funny to this day. Our next product failure was also a food product failure. It's Satisfries by Burger King, launched in 2013 to be an alternative to regular Burger King fries. It was supposed to be healthier, and it would absorb less oil, and people would, apparently, according to Burger King, would go for it. But what happened was they didn't. There was virtually no demand for it because, hey, we eat fries because they taste good, not because we want a healthy alternative. So what happened was Burger King had to discontinue it, and believe me, I don't think anyone misses it. Let's take you back in time to 1995, where we're going to talk about Microsoft Bob, which was a kind of UI element to make your computers a lot more user-friendly and beginner-friendly. It was basically something that would help you get used to the interface of the computer. But what happened was users found the interface even more boring and way more irritating, harder to understand. So what happened was the next year Bob was discontinued, but Bill Gates had some say on it. Apparently he thought that it had more potential, it was ahead of its time, and with more effort it could have reached a better performance, but it still doesn't change the fact that users did not want it. It was boring and did not make it any more useful. You might be familiar with our next product failure. Facebook Home was launched in 2013, and basically the app's whole thing was that it made user experience a lot easier for Facebook users. They wouldn't even have to unlock their phones to scroll through Facebook, and there were a lot of different features such as that. But one fundamental issue was that it wasn't designed right. Early users reported many problems with the system and user experience of it all. It just wouldn't work properly. One of the reasons why was that the developers were basically all Apple users. The Android side was kind of ignored, but even for the Apple interface, it wasn't good enough. It was also a poorly timed app because it coincided with the time that people were getting a lot more conscious about how social media worked, and everyone was kind of trying to reduce their screen time, and Facebook Home just wasn't helping, so it failed. Next up, we have Microsoft's Zune, which was designed to be the rival of Apple's iPod, but somehow it was released 5 years later. iPod was released. On top of it all, it had nothing to differentiate it from iPods. It had no additional features. It kind of looked the same. Plus, on top of it all, it did nothing on the marketing side. We all know how the iPod commercials were, they just had the edge. Zune had nothing on it, and it eventually failed. It was discontinued in 2012. Our very last product failure today comes from Apple, surprisingly. Apple Newton was a very promising product back in 1992. It had everything. You could handwrite on it. It was a calculator that you could carry around. It had built-in modem, and it could fit in your palm. So perfect. What happened was, though, that the product had major flaws. It had screen defects, it had battery problems. The very main feature of the product was unusable. The handwriting had so many glitches. On top of it all, it was very expensive for the time. It came for a price of $700. So it was not only laggy, bad, flawed, it was also overpriced, so obviously it was a failure. So after discussing what a product failure is and how you can avoid it, what makes a product failure, some examples, let's talk about how you can avoid product failure. So the rule number one is to always conduct your market research properly. You never want to go with a project that is not demanded nor needed. So you should always check in with your audience. You should set the right audience in the market and work toward those users, those people that are actually going to use it and are in need of your new product. Another thing to care about is to make sure that your users actually understand what your product is, because however great your product might be, it is as good as the limitations of your users' comprehension. So before launch, what you want to do is you set the description of the tool very simply and basic. You just want to make sure that it's just the message is clear. And after launching the tool, what you want to do is that your users understand the tool while hands-on. So you might want to use different options to onboard users at that point too. Third thing you want to do is you want to make sure your marketing plan is a well-executed one. After conducting your market research, you now have the audience at your hand. You know who your people are. What you want to make sure is that they get to see and interact with your product before it even launches. So you want to make sure the schedule, the planning, everything is right. Just focus on the right marketing strategies. If there is a worse thing than under-promising, it is definitely over-promising, and you never want to lie about the capabilities of your product. Remember, no man's sky. If it cannot perform something yet, make sure you make it happen, or just don't promise it altogether, because it is it might look easy to come back from failure, but it's not. It honestly is not. So you want to make sure that you don't overpromise, you don't overestimate, and you don't lie about your product. The number one worst thing you can do, and the number one thing that will definitely set you up on that failure road, is rushing the product. There are times, of course, that products need to be rushed. There are plans, there are people involved that needs to be paid, but rushing a product is almost always a bad idea, because there is going to be flaws, the testings will not be finished, and obviously the first users of the product are going to find out. It might even cause legal problems if your product is something actually consumable and is something that can cause damage to the users. So never ever rush it. But to wrap it up, I of course know that it is hard to not fail. I just told you that 95% of all products fail every year, but it is not such a hard job once you get it in your head that you just have to follow through with a frame of work, a mindset. You just want to make sure that it is easy for users to use, and it's something different that you bring to the table. So this was Sarah from User Guiding. If you have any more funny or devastating product failures in mind, don't be shy. Put them in the comments section. See you another time. Bye.